On a beautiful day, August 9, 1999, Russian President Boris Yeltsin introduced a relatively unknown figure as the new acting Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin. Few could have predicted that this quiet moment would mark the beginning of a political reign that would shape Russia for decades. Just 1 month later, a series of deadly bombings shook Moscow and Volgodonsk, stirring fear and paving the way for Putin's swift rise to power. Amid the suspicions and the conspiracy theories, Putin capitalized on the chaos, leading military strikes in Chechnya and quickly securing the presidency. But who is Vladimir Putin? What shaped his path to become one of the most powerful leaders in modern history? To understand Putin's story, we must first understand the organization that forged him. The KGB, the Soviet Union's intelligence service, the KGB, was one of the most feared and powerful institutions of the time. It operated above the law, functioning as both a secret police force and a shadow government. Its agents were tasked with keeping a watchful eye on dissidents, foreign enemies, and even its own citizens. The KGB was where the Soviet state concentrated its deepest and darkest secrets, and it required a constant influx of new recruits to fulfill its daunting mission. One such recruit was a young law student from Leningrad named Vladimir Putin. Spotted for his potential while studying at Leningrad State University, Putin graduated in 1975. After which he was promptly recruited by the KGB. Many agents were forced into the role, unable to refuse the heavy hand of the Soviet regime. But Putin was different. He joined willingly, driven by an ambition to serve the Soviet state from within the shadows. His first assignments were mundane, confined to the dreary office spaces of Leningrad, where he shuffled papers and performed bureaucratic duties for the intelligence service, but he was biding his time, waiting for the opportunity to prove his worth. That opportunity came in early 1980s when he was summoned to Moscow to attend an elite foreign intelligence training institute. This was not just an academic course, it was the pinnacle of Soviet espionage education, a place where spies were molded into masters of their craft. After completing his training, Putin was dispatched to Dresden, East Germany, deep in the heart of the Cold War. Dresden at the time was a boundary city where the ideological battle between communism and capitalism played out in every street corner. It was a place rich in Cold War intrigue, a prime site for espionage, and Putin's task was clear: recruit party officials, spy on Westerners, and report back of the activities of NATO. He was also tasked with stealing Western technology as the Eastern Bloc was beginning to fall behind its Western rivals in technological advancements. For 5 years, Putin quietly worked from his office at the local KGB station, methodically building his network and honing his skills as a manipulator of people and information. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was weakening and the winds of change began to sweep through Eastern Europe. Communism began to crumble. Putin returned to Leningrad, ostensibly working as an aide to the university's dean. But everyone knew the truth. Putin remained a KGB operative, embedded within the university to monitor students and identify potential recruits. Yet, the Soviet Union, which had shaped so much of Putin's identity, was on the verge of collapse. The Soviet Union officially disintegrated in 1991 after years of failed reforms, economic stagnation, and pressure from the United States. For many within the KGB, the collapse of the Soviet Union represented the death of everything they had worked for. Putin saw it coming and resigned from the KGB shortly before the end. In a twist of fate, he found employment with one of his old law professors, Anatoly Sobchak. Sobchak was a progressive figure in post-Soviet Russia. He was a leading voice advocating for democratic reforms, and in the new Russia, he became the first democratically elected mayor of Leningrad, which by then had reverted to its original name, St. Petersburg. Putin worked at City Hall under Sobchak and witnessed firsthand the devastation of the post-Soviet period. The collapse of the Soviet Union had left Russia in economic ruin. Inflation soared. Life expectancy dropped by over 5 years between 1990 and 1994. And in some places, the rubble was worth less than bricks. For the millions of Russians who had despised communism, the fall of the Soviet regime brought chaos rather than salvation. National humiliation followed as Russia found itself dependent on foreign aid and loans from the International Monetary Fund. Putin, like many others, saw his country fall from its status as a global superpower to one reliant on Western handouts. For him, it was personal. In 1996, Sobchak lost his position as mayor, and Putin, now adrift from his political mentor, moved to Moscow. It was in the capital where his rapid ascent began. He took a seemingly low-ranking position in the Kremlin's property management department, which oversaw the management of state assets. The job, however, gave Putin leverage over Russia's vast political network, allowing him to build connections and grant favors to influential insiders. In a matter of years, he became deputy chief of Yeltsin's presidential staff. At the same time, Putin worked towards obtaining a PhD in economics, though questions persist about whether he actually authored his dissertation. His subject, maximizing mineral resources in Russia, seemed little more than a formality. It was not education that Putin sought, but credentials that would smooth his path to the highest echelons of power. In 1998, Putin had become the director of the FSB, the successor to the KGB. How a mid-ranking KGB officer from Dresden could rise so quickly through the ranks of Russia's political elite is a mystery that continues to puzzle historians. Perhaps it was his keen intellect or his ruthless pragmatism that endeared him to Russia's power brokers, or perhaps someone higher up had plans for him. Boris Yeltsin, now nearing the end of his political career, was a man worn down by decades in Soviet and Russian politics. He had survived a coup, endured health problems, exacerbated by heavy drinking, and grown pessimistic about Russia's future. Yeltsin believed his final act should be to appoint a successor who could restore Russia's stature as a world power. Among Yeltsin's closest adversaries was the reformist Boris Nemtsov, a provincial governor who had caught Yeltsin's eye as a potential successor. Nemtsov was a pro-Western liberal Democrat with actual political experience, a stark contrast to Putin. At one point, Yeltsin even introduced Nemtsov to US President Bill Clinton as Russia's future leader. However, fate soon intervened. In August 1998, Russia's economy collapsed under the weight of its debts, triggered by a financial crisis in Asia, the price of oil, gas, and metals. The backbone of Russia's economy plummeted. The Russian government defaulted on its debts, the ruble was devalued, and millions of Russians found themselves impoverished. Nemtsov's pro-Western economic reforms were blamed for the disaster, and his political career was irreparably damaged. With Nemtsov out of the picture, Yeltsin had only one real choice left: Vladimir Putin. But there was one problem. No one knew who Putin was. While Yeltsin could appoint Putin as a prime minister, Russia was still nominally a democracy, and Putin would have to win a national election to stand any chance of success. Putin needed to be a known figure. This was where the apartment bombings became crucial. As Russia reeled from the series of bombings that tore through Moscow and Volgodonsk, Putin's swift and uncompromising response to the crisis brought him to the forefront of the nation's consciousness. But as the bombings subsided, troubling questions began to emerge. On the evening of September 22, 1999, residents of the city of Ryazan noticed two men unloading sacks from a car with altered license plates and taking them into the basement of an apartment building. Alerted by the suspicious activity, they contacted the local police, who discovered what appeared to be a bomb. It was defused before it could explode, and the authorities were quick to praise the vigilance of the residents and the effectiveness of the security forces. But when the two suspects were apprehended, they presented identification from the FSB. What followed was a confusing backtrack by the government. It was claimed that the entire incident wasn't attempted bombing, but a training exercise, and that the sacks had contained only sugar. The explanation did little to quell suspicions, especially when laboratory results indicated that the sacks contained traces of RDX, the same explosive used in the earlier bombings. Despite these inconsistencies, Putin's bombing campaign in Chechnya helped to consolidate his image as a strong leader capable of restoring order to a nation on the brink of collapse. The bombings, whether by design or accident, had catapulted Putin to the presidency. On March 26, 2000, with 53% of the vote, Putin became the president of Russia. Putin's first months in office were consumed by a crisis that challenged his ability to fulfill his primary promise to the Russian people, keeping them safe. In August 2000, less than 6 months into his presidency, the Kursk, a nuclear-powered submarine, sank in the Barents Sea during a naval exercise. The explosion that caused the sinking was so severe that Norwegian seismic stations detected it, while Russian authorities initially claimed that the Kursk was merely experiencing technical difficulties. It soon became clear that the submarine was the bottom of the sea and its crew was in mortal danger. Offers of international assistance poured in, but Putin's government refused, insisting that they had the situation under control. In reality, they were incapable of mounting a successful rescue. By the time the Russian Navy admitted the extent of the disaster, all 118 crew members had perished. Putin, who had been on vacation when the incident occurred, faced a furious public backlash. Widows and mothers of the victims demanded accountability, with some even being forcibly sedated when they confronted the president. Yet, despite this public relations disaster, Putin remained firmly in control. His early missteps, while tragic, did not weaken his grip on power. At the same time, Putin was working to reposition Russia on the world stage. For years, Russia had been overshadowed by the West, and Putin's goal was clear: to restore Russia's status as a great power. His method was to consolidate domestic control, while subtly undermining the influence of the United States and the NATO abroad. In 2007, at the Munich Security Conference, Putin delivered a speech that stunned Western diplomats in blunt terms. He accused the United States of arrogance, hypocrisy, and violating the principles of democracy. "This is a world of one master, one sovereign," he said. "They constantly teach Russia about democracy, but those who teach us do not really want to learn themselves." Putin was signaling that Russia would no longer be content to play a subordinate role in global politics. He advocated for a multipolar world where Russia would challenge the dominance of the West. If there was one country that represented a fault line between Russia and the West, it was Ukraine. Historically intertwined with Russia, Ukraine had been the breadbasket of the Soviet Union and was strategically vital for Russia's military and economic interests. However, the Ukrainian people increasingly looked westward, seeking closer ties with the European Union and NATO. For Putin, this was an existential threat. In late 2013, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, under pressure from Moscow, refused to sign a long-anticipated trade agreement with the European Union. The move triggered massive protests in Kyiv as hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians demanded closer integration with Europe and an end to Russian influence. Known as the Revolution of Dignity, these protests eventually led to the Yanukovych's ousting in February 2014. Putin responded by annexing Crimea, a region of Ukraine that had been transferred to Ukrainian control during the Soviet era. The swift and bloodless takeover of Crimea marked a turning point in European geopolitics, the first time since World War II that one European country had seized territory from another. Yet Crimea was just the beginning. In the eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, pro-Russian separatists declared independence from Ukraine. As fighting broke out between the Ukrainian army and the separatists, Russia covertly supplied weapons and manpower to the insurgents. In the West, it became clear that Putin's ambitions extended beyond Crimea. He sought to destabilize Ukraine, preventing it from ever fully aligning with NATO or the European Union. The conflict escalated in July 2014 when Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 was shut down over eastern Ukraine, killing all 298 people on board. The missile that brought down the plane was traced back to Russian-backed separatists, further isolating Putin on the international stage. Despite mounting evidence of Russian involvement in Ukraine, Putin continued to deny any official involvement. The war dragged on, claiming thousands of lives and displacing millions of people. Putin's vision of a new world order. Putin's aggression in Ukraine, while alarming to Western leaders, was part of a broader strategy. Russia was no longer content to play a secondary role in world affairs. Instead, Putin sought to reshape the global order, weakening the influence of the United States and NATO. To achieve this, he needed powerful allies. Enter Xi Jinping. Xi and Putin, though from different political systems, shared a common goal: the creation of a multipolar world. They envisioned a world where the United States no longer held unchallenged sway over global affairs, and where countries like Russia and China could assert their influence in their respective regions. The two leaders formed a strong bond, meeting dozens of times and signing numerous trade and military agreements. Under Xi's leadership, China became Russia's largest trading partner, propping up the Russian economy through purchases of oil and natural gas. This partnership was critical for Putin, especially as his ambitions grew. In February 2022, Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Despite the military buildup in the weeks leading up to the invasion, many in the West were shocked that Putin would take such a drastic step. They had underestimated his resolve. The invasion, which Putin euphemistically called a special military operation, was intended to bring Ukraine back into Russia's sphere of influence. However, Putin's gamble did not go as planned. The Ukrainian resistance proved far stronger than anticipated, and international sanctions crippled Russia's economy rather than weakening NATO. The invasion strengthened it. Finland and Sweden, long neutral countries, applied for membership in the alliance, and NATO members began pouring military aid into Ukraine. By mid-2023, cracks began to appear in Putin's once ironclad role. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, a private military organization that had been instrumental in Russia's covert operations in Ukraine, became an outspoken critic of the Russian military's handling of the war. Prigozhin led an armed rebellion, capturing key military installations in the southern city of Rostov-on-Don and sending a column of tanks towards Moscow. Though the rebellion was short-lived, it exposed deep divisions within Russia's military and political elite. For the first time in years, Putin's grip on power seemed a little vulnerable.
The Wagner rebellion may have been quelled, but it served as a stark reminder that even the most authoritarian regimes are not immune to internal dissent. As Russia's economy continues to suffer from sanctions and its military struggles to maintain its hold in Ukraine, Putin faces mounting challenges to his role. The man who once appeared invincible now faces the most significant test of his political career.
Vladimir Putin's rise to power is marked by strategy, manipulation, and determination. From his KGB days to leading the Kremlin, his goal has been to restore Russia as a great power. He has defied Western expectations, silenced enemies, and reshaped global politics. However, the ongoing war in Ukraine and growing internal dissent cast doubt on his legacy. Russia remains economically isolated, and its military faces challenges. Yet, Putin has consistently shown resilience. Whether he survives this crisis is uncertain, but his impact on the world is undeniable, and his story is far from over.